Welcome. Hi, I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and I'm delighted to see so many of you, even though this evening is a little bit damp. We're finally getting a fall evening, which is nice. And I'd like to give a special welcome to those of you in the simulcast tonight. So now I know this is week 3 of the lecture series, so you know what I'm going to say next, right? Be sure you silence your phone or anything else that makes noise. And I, of course, am so glad to see so many members here. We had a lovely reception just before this, and I hope you've all had a chance to see Mid-Century Master, the photography of Alfred Eisenstaedt, and also the Dutch artist Bouke de Vries and War and Pieces, which is on the dining room table. You may have seen in the museum section of the Sunday Washington Post, there was a big half-page ad about it. It's quite handsome, I thought. And of course, we with 2 special exhibitions, and I hope some of you have had opportunity to see all the new goodies in the museum shop upstairs. And we have a wonderful, delicious new fall menu in the cafe. There are lots and lots of reasons for you to share Hillwood with your friends. And so I do hope that those of you who aren't members will become members shortly. So I hope you've had the chance to see Mid-Century Master, and if you study that show, what a keen eye and a quick shutter can do to transform public understanding of history. And Eisenstaedt, of course, had a particular gift for capturing larger-than-life personalities and genuine human moments with leaders and luminaries of the past, of course, our very own Marjorie Merriweather Post, but as well as every U.S. president from Herbert Hoover to Bill Clinton. So tonight, Ken Walsh shines a deeper light on the way that White House photographers create visual histories and witness the human and deeply personal moments of presidential triumph, defeat, joy, and anguish. Ken is a prize-winning journalist who has covered the White House since 1986 for U.S. News and World Report. He has covered the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. He's a former president. Yeah, that makes you tired just listening to him. A former president of the White House Correspondents Association. He serves as an analyst on television and radio, and he has won the most prestigious awards for White House coverage. Ken is also an adjunct professor in communication at American University and a popular speaker who travels around this country and abroad. He has written 8 books, most recently Ultimate Insiders, White House Photographers and How They Shape History, which is, of course, available upstairs in the museum shop. Ken is a New York City native who spent nearly a decade as a reporter and editor in Denver. He and his wife, Barclay Walsh, have 2 children and now live in Bethesda and Shadyside, Maryland. I know that following tonight's lecture, Ken would be delighted to autograph books. So please join me in welcoming Kenneth T. Walsh.
Thank you all for coming. I'm glad we're not competing against the Washington Nationals tonight, but they're moving on to the World Series, as you know. The idea of the keen eye and quick shutter, which was just mentioned, that's a good way to summarize what a lot of these White House photographers do, and that's what we're going to spend the next hour or so discussing. But when you've covered the White House as long as I have, 33 years now, you're always looking for new ways and different ways to see the presidents and get a sense of what they are like as people, not just policymakers. And that's what I tried to do in the books that I've written in particular, and that's what I do more and more in my daily and weekly journalism. In the White House photographers are a good way to do that because I've done this, used the same technique using different themes and thematic structures to see the president's Air Force One and what the presidents are like aboard the plane, which came out some years ago, but it's still very popular, I must say. The president's homes and retreats and what the presidents are like there, and various other sort of paradigms. But lots of times when you cover the White House, some of the most important and interesting ways of looking at it are right in front of you if you look carefully. And what this discussion tonight is about is one of those examples, the White House photographers. These are the staff photographers I'm talking about, not the news photographers. It's a much different role, a much different opportunity that they have to see the presidents. What the White House photographers, the staff photographers, have morphed into is not only visual historians, both privately and publicly, but also observers of the presidents because they have amazing access. There's really nobody at the White House who has more access to the presidents except the first families. These photographers, if the president gives them the latitude, and I'll talk about presidents who have and presidents who haven't. President Trump, by the way, today does not give his photographer a lot of access. We'll talk about that in a bit. But what does it take to be a really good White House staff photographer? First of all, you have to be a good photographer, of course, but you also have to have a trusting relationship with the president and the first family, particularly with the first lady, because then you get to see the private things that go on, the moments of anguish and triumph privately behind the scenes, in addition to the policy matters. And you also need the trust of the staff, so you can see things like when the president's making a particularly anguished decision. Sometimes presidents will allow the photographers to record that and see that, sometimes they don't. I'm always asked, by the way, and we can have one less question about this, because I'll answer it now, because all the photographers' pictures are ours as taxpayers. We're entitled to get copies of them for only the production cost. So you can pay $12 and you can get all the pictures basically that I'm showing you. You can't get the pictures taken by private photographers hired by presidents, and that has happened a lot too. But you can get the public record photographs by going to the National Archives or the presidential libraries, and they make it a lot easier than they used to get them online. So what I'm going to do is we're going to run through all the modern presidents, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, who I consider the first modern president. But one thing we're going to do, and by the way, this is the cover of my book, and we're going to start with James Polk, the first president whose photograph we still have from when he was in office. This was taken in 1848. I'm showing this to give you a sense of how photography has changed, and so much of the success of photography depends on the technology. And that'll become clear as we move along here. In those days, this is a daguerreotype. This was a very primitive form of photography. But just keep this in mind as you see how much we've advanced since then. No matter who it was, a president or anybody, when they had their picture taken, they had to stay stationary because the frame was exposed in the camera and they couldn't move. So you don't see it here, but presidents, whoever, had to have a clamp put on their necks, along their spine, to keep them still. And it was pretty much of an ordeal for them. They have other things to do, presumably, and they have to sit there for a long time. But he had his picture taken. There might have been other pictures taken of presidents in that era, but this is the only one that's survived that we've found. But just give you a sense of how this whole photography notion has changed. I like to start off in detail with Lincoln, because Lincoln has set the pace for so much of our notions of presidential leadership and decision-making and personalities dealing with the presidency. Lincoln started off thought of as a frontiersman, a guy from the hinterland at the time, the rail splitter, building fences. This was the image he had. And he felt he had to have more gravitas to be elected president in 1860. So what he did was, he was giving a speech in New York at a place called Cooper Union, which is where the intelligentsia of the time would gather from lots of the eastern seaboard, and they talk about the leaders at the time and presidential candidates, and he went there to give his platform. He decided to have a photograph taken, the first president to do this in his campaign. So this is before he grew his beard, but he decided he would go to the day of his speech. He went to the studio of a photographer named Matthew Brady, who became the most famous Civil War photographer later, partly because he knew Lincoln, and Lincoln gave him incredible access to the battlefields. But he went in to see Brady, and Brady knew he was coming, but then he was startled. He hadn't met Lincoln before. First of all, he was struck by Lincoln is not a good-looking man, he thought, as he said later. His clothes were all dusty and wrinkled. He looked like his neck was too long. He looked too gangly. So instead of taking the headshot, which they did at the time, Matthew Brady pulled the camera back and got a sort of a 3/4 length portrait of Lincoln. And you can see what he's done here. You don't see the problems he has with his complexion. He pulls his collar up so he doesn't look like he's as gangly as he was. He puts his left hand on a stack of books. And at the time, when these photographs were distributed, they called them cartes de visite in French, postcard-sized photographs that were distributed all over the country of famous people, but Lincoln brought it into the political realm. But people would study them. People did not have the short attention span that they have today. So people looked and they noticed the hand on the books. They noticed the stature of Lincoln, much taller than the men of his age. And this worked. He was able to convey some gravitas to the country, and of course he won the election of 1860. He later said the reason he won was because the speech at Cooper Union was a success in outlining his platform on slavery and secession and so on, but also because of this photograph, the first political photograph taken of a campaigning president. When he's in office, this is the image we still have of him. He understood the importance of image, the first president to do so. And he had about 70 photographs taken when he was in office. And this is the one he liked in particular, showing the resolute, strong Abraham Lincoln. This is a picture many of us are familiar with. I say he had 70 pictures taken while he was president. You know how many pictures presidents have taken them now in a year? About 2 million? About 2 million. Then as time went on, he let the country see, through the photographs that were distributed in the cartes de visite and so on, what toll the war was taking on him, and because it was taking such a toll on the country. So by the end of his presidency, he let the country see what a grueling experience this was for him and the sacrifices he was making personally. Of course, he lost a son to yellow fever or another type of fever during the Civil War, but he was just terribly stricken by all the lives that were being lost, and the country was being torn apart. He looks a little spectral, ghost-like here. This was taken about 3 weeks before he was assassinated. And people are really startled to see the Lincoln at the end of his life, when he was really showing the impact of the war, but he wanted the country to see that he was sharing in the sacrifices that other people were making, and he succeeded in doing that. Now we fast forward. This is Teddy Roosevelt. We don't have time to talk about all the presidents, but we're talking about some highlights. Teddy Roosevelt believed in what he called the strenuous life, where you would achieve, you'd go do your best in everything privately and publicly. So when he was president, he tried to show the strenuous life through photography. Didn't have a staff photographer at the White House. That position didn't exist at the time, but he would hire outside photographers to take his picture. He liked to jump horses. He boxed. In fact, he lost the partial sight in one eye because he was boxing as president on the South Lawn. His opponents were a little too good because he was getting his head banged around, but he liked to hike. He did all kinds of vigorous things, including jumping horses. He'd leave. He wouldn't tell his wife where he was going. The Secret Service had been invented, so he'd go off with a couple of bodyguards, and he'd jump horses in Rock Creek Park, and then he'd come back, and his wife would notice his face was all bruised, he was cut up, and he was sort of limping. She said, "You've been riding again today, haven't you?" And he had been. He would fall off the horse. But he didn't like that picture taken, of course, so he'd have to get back on and keep jumping the horse until he got a picture like this, the vigorous, strenuous life Teddy Roosevelt. He also did things to convey his policies through photography. He was the first president to travel outside the United States. This is when he visited the Panama Canal. You can see him in the white suit on a steam shovel, and this was what he considered his crowning achievement, having the Panama Canal built. What he's doing is he's transferring his own personal popularity to his agenda, to his policies, to his projects. And he was very successful. He understands how imagery can convey both a policy sense and a personal sense, and he does that. He goes out to Yosemite, and he meets John Muir, the famous conservationist, and he uses this photograph. You can see Yosemite, the waterfall behind them. he's using this to show the importance of national parks, what later became the national parks, taking land and preserving it from development so the country can enjoy it for generations into the future. And he succeeds. He is associated with the national parks of the country, so he's made that bridge, photographs, personal popularity, agenda popularity. He sort of invents that notion, which presidents have tried to do ever since. His distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, comes into office. This is another interesting story. Franklin Roosevelt, this is the image he liked to convey, the jaunty, optimistic president. Of course, he takes office in 1933 during the depths of the Depression. But the country wanted exactly the kind of leadership that Roosevelt could provide, the optimistic guy. I'll get us through this. Just follow me and we'll figure out how to get through the Depression. And then World War II. And he did a lot of this with photography. The newspapers were using photographs at the time, and this is the image he loved to convey. He was very picky about the camera angles and so on, and he would have his staff tell the photographers, you know, if you play ball and you make the president look good, you'll get more access than photographers and reporters have ever had before. The photographers agreed to do this, and they got a lot of access to him. However, they did feel that they were taken advantage of, because what would happen is, first of all, this is the earlier Franklin Roosevelt meeting with Stalin and Churchill at one of his international conferences, the confident, healthy-looking Franklin Roosevelt. But then he, as Lincoln had done, let the country see his decline. And by the end of his presidency, look how he's changed. He had terrible heart disease, because he died of heart disease in his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. But he lets the country see this through his staff photographers and sometimes the news photographers. But what he didn't want the country to see was the private Roosevelt whose legs were paralyzed from polio. I mentioned the news photographers had sort of an agreement with his press secretary and with Roosevelt. They would make him look good, and they would get tremendous access. But a lot of them had doubts about this as time went on, because they felt they were in sort of a conspiracy of silence or omission, because the country never knew that his legs were paralyzed from polio. I think people knew that he had polio and he had a disability, but they didn't realize he never recovered the use of his legs. He had to use a wheelchair. He only let people see this when he was at Hyde Park, New York, at his home there. You can visit the home. This is him with one of his nieces, and he'd use crutches. Many times he'd use this wheelchair even at the White House, but the new photographers would come on the White House beat and take a picture of him with braces on his legs, with the wheelchair, with his crutches and so on. And the veteran photographers would slap the camera out of the hands of the new photographer and say, "We don't take pictures of like that of the president." And they didn't. This is a rare picture of him. He was carried in and out of his car when he went places. This is why you see those pictures of him in the car waving, like I showed you in the beginning. He didn't want to be seen getting in and out of it because he had to be carried. And this is a very rare picture that we found, my wife and I, who's a professional researcher, of him campaigning and being carried out of the car. You can see the people getting ready to take him out of the car. At this point, he gets out of the car, and according to the count that I found, he says to the news photographers, no pictures, boys, of me getting in and out of the contraption or using the contraption on my legs. And they respected it. This was taken by a bystander. So this was sort of an agreement that the photographers made. Reporters didn't report on his disability either, by the way. It's not just the photographers, but it was something we can't imagine happening today, but it happened with Franklin Roosevelt. Now, then again, this is the V for victory. This is the image he liked to convey, and he used photography and image to do that very effectively. Harry Truman comes into office in April of 1945 after Roosevelt dies, and he gets along very, very well with the photographers. Now, again, there are no staff photographers at the White House at this time. That comes in under Kennedy. But they're using outside photographers who they trust, who are being paid by their political funds, or sometimes out of their own pockets, and they're using the news photographers. Truman gets along very, very well with his news photographers. They called him Truman the Human, and again, to show how close the relationship was at the time that you wouldn't have again today, is that they thought that he wasn't looking as good as he should. So they gave him a pair of glasses, not the thick glasses he wore that they felt distorted his eyes. They gave him very thin lenses, and he couldn't see anything. But he tried it out. He couldn't read his speech, and he said, boys, I can't. They were all men at the time. He said, boys, I can't read the speeches. People are just going to have to see me as I am. So he went back to using his regular glasses. But he gets along very well with the photographers, and they're sort of rooting for Truman. Now, you talk about fake news. Well, which we hear a lot about today. This is a wonderful picture reflecting the buoyant Truman of the 1948 campaign. The Chicago Tribune felt he was going to lose to Thomas Dewey, so they actually printed up editions of the paper with stories in it saying that Truman had lost, sort of boilerplate stories. And, of course, Truman won, so he holds up the picture, the front page, and the photographers get the picture, and very embarrassed, mortifies the Chicago Tribune, but he always loved this picture. Truman, beyond this, though, was not a guy to get a lot of attention and seek a lot of attention, and he didn't do that, and I think that was something he probably should have done more of. But he did use the imagery to show the victor behind the scenes, the sort of the little guy taking on the big shots of politics, which this picture shows. Now, President Eisenhower comes into office. We'll have to move kind of rapidly so I can get to as many presidents as I can. President Eisenhower wants to return normalcy. That's what he feels he's elected to do with his wife, Mamie. He had been commander of American forces in the Normandy invasion. He felt he had nothing to prove. So he wasn't interested in using photography, as other presidents did subsequently or had up until then, to convey particular images of himself. He just felt, I'm going to do the job, and the country doesn't want the excitement anymore. They don't want to be shaken up every day. So I'm just going to do the job, and he wasn't that interested in pictures of himself. He occasionally allowed pictures taken privately, very rare though, including at his Gettysburg farm. Now, when he went to his Gettysburg farm, not too far from Camp David, by the way, his wife, Mamie, felt she wanted Ike to have his own sense of normalcy, so she didn't want him to make decisions there, decide policy, have meetings. She just wanted him to have private time with her and the family. And she'd play cards. The men and the women would do it separately in those days, and they'd play Scrabble. Now, Ike doesn't look like he's wild about playing the Scrabble here, does he? I think his mind is elsewhere. But Mamie insisted that they do it, so he went ahead. And but this was the environment that he had, and the photographers at the time said that this is what they felt the country wanted as well. Now, the real excitement and glamour of the presidency came with President Kennedy. He understands photography very well. This is his family, Joe Kennedy, his father, with the younger Kennedy brood. Joe Kennedy, we think of him as an investor and a fabulously wealthy businessman. He was also a Hollywood producer. He made movies. He understood the idea of celebrity. He understood the country was changing. It wanted some excitement. He understood the idea of image. And he was trying to convey that first for his son, Joe Jr. You can see here on the top right side of the picture, Joe Jr. was killed as a pilot over Europe in World War II. So Jack, in the center of the picture in the back, goes to the top of the ladder as the man who his father is grooming for the presidency. The father wanted to be president. He realized he was never going to be president, so he grooms Jack. And so he creates this tremendous imagery, largely with still photography, of President Kennedy before the presidency as this hero. And this is him commanding his PT boat in World War II in the Pacific, PT 109. You might remember there was a movie made starring Cliff Robertson, and it just conveyed the idea of Jack Kennedy as a hero. He was a hero, actually. He did save some of his crew members when this boat was cut into by a Japanese vessel. But the father made sure the country understood at the start of Jack's political career about his history and his glamorous background. His marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier was the social hit of the social season in the year they were married in the early 50s. This is in Rhode Island, where they were married in a fabulous estate. They're just sitting down at their wedding reception here, and so what you're seeing now is the start of the conveying of the image of this glamorous couple that the father is promoting. He managed to arrange the photographs like this and other photographs to be published in the picture magazines at the time, like Look and Life, very, very popular at the time. They get covers of the Kennedys on those magazines you can still find, but the father understands he's building an image here to groom this man, his son, for the presidency, and he succeeds. Kennedy wins the 1960 election. It's very close. It's so close the night before they don't know he's won. Then the next morning it's clear he's won, very, very close, as I say. The family gets together to the pose for a formal picture. I'm not showing you the actual formal picture. This is the more interesting picture. This is before they all became completely aware of the camera, ready to snap. But you can see how Jack Kennedy is the center of everything, the jubilation in the family. The father looking with admiration at the son. The son has achieved what the father could not. The father has made his family the most powerful family in the world. And this is what he's, and you can see Rose, the mother, Jackie's there, Teddy, Bobby, Peter Lawford, the Hollywood connection, just they're all there. And this is a wonderful picture just showing that jubilation of that family that day. Now, Kennedy understands when he's president photography himself. Now he takes where his father left off. He's using his family, and I say using advisedly, he is using his children to gain the impression of being a wonderful father and a family man. He was actually a very good father. Not such a great husband, as we've learned, as a womanizer, but this is a case where what he's doing is he's bringing in outside photographers who he admires and paying them to take great pictures. Jacques Lowe, a famous New York photographer, took this picture. He brings in a guy named Stanley Tredick, another outside photographer. And he hires the first staff photographer at the White House, a guy named Cecil Stoughton, who was a photographer in the Army. Cecil now becomes the chief White House photographer. This is another wonderful picture. Just before they take the actual formal picture of the young family, of course, any of us who have kids know the kids, maybe they don't behave when they're getting their picture taken. Well, Caroline starts nibbling on her mother's pearls. And a lot of people from that time, my parents remember this picture. They remember this is what happens with kids. And it just was very endearing to a lot of people, and Kennedy understood this. He would have the kids come into the White House, and they'd dance for him, and they'd do somersaults, and he'd sit there, and he'd clap his hands. He had terrible back problems, by the way. He could barely lift the children up, so you rarely see a picture of him lifting the kids and playing with them, but he liked to have them come in before they went to bed and dance for Daddy. He also had other wonderful pictures taken of him, and this is him and Caroline at Hyannisport, their family compound up in Cape Cod. And this is the most famous picture of Kennedy with his kids. Just shows how he understood the value of imagery and photography. What happens here is he wants to have a photo spread done of the day in the life of the president with his son. But Jackie, his wife, says, well, the kids are getting overexposed. I don't like what it's doing to them. They're getting too full of themselves. So let's cool it on the kids getting pictures taken for a while. So Jack says, okay. Jackie goes on vacation to Greece with her entourage, and the president calls Stanley Tredick, an outside photographer, and says, Jackie's out of town. The coast is clear. Come on over. So Stanley comes to the Oval Office, and as he gets there, something sweeps by him at knee level. It's John Jr. in his pajamas and robe, and Stanley says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to my little house. This is where he went. So what was happening is that John Jr. was getting in there. The daddy would pretend he didn't realize he was there. Of course he did. And then he'd open the little door and he'd try to scare people. Diplomats, members of Congress, heads of state, reporters, whatever. And so Stanley got this wonderful, wonderful picture that a lot of people always remember. But so Kennedy is now understanding that the family is very important in image making for the presidency. He was very good on his feet. This is him in a news conference. Again, we remember these images of him, the vigorous young president, being sort of dominating the news people at the time, including television, radio, and so on. So he's very good as conveying his image this way. He allows pictures to be taken of him in settings that presidents did not allow before. Private meetings with other leaders. Here he is with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union in 1961. When Khrushchev decides he can take the measure of Kennedy. You can see Kennedy looks like he's might be trying a little bit too hard to impress Khrushchev, who looks very sort of cynical about the whole thing, and he was. He concluded at these meetings in Vienna that Kennedy was a callow and weak leader, and he could take advantage of him. And you get a little sense of that from this picture. But what happened was the misimpression that Khrushchev had about the Kennedy weakness helped lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year, when Khrushchev acted on the idea that Kennedy is not strong enough to deal with this kind of a crisis, and it turned out he was. So this is a little backstory about what this picture is showing here, this very difficult moment where Kennedy feels that this summit with Khrushchev did not go well and failed, and it actually did fail. Another interesting point, Kennedy had a very bad relationship with the military, with the chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is what you see here. You can get the sense of that tension in the picture. So what's happening is that he's allowing his photographer to take pictures of this stuff that later becomes historic. He's very skeptical of them. He blames them in part for the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the exiles from Cuba invading Cuba and failing, thinking they're going to get help from the U.S., and the U.S. didn't help them as they thought they would. So it's a huge, colossal blunder. So he always blamed the military for saying it was going to work better than it would. It did. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis came, he was very cynical about the military, and he didn't listen to them. They were talking about bombing Cuba, and so we have another world war, we can beat them, and all this sort of thing. So he uses his own judgment, but you get a little sense from this picture of that distance that's developing between him and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, one thing Kennedy did also, which I like to say that I wish presidents would do more of, is they looked, listened, and learned. And this is what Kennedy did. He saw the civil rights movement going on. He looked at photographs himself, and he looked at the TV coverage, but particularly the news photographs of these African-American protesters getting beaten up, police dogs attacking them, fire hoses used against them, and so on. And he respected physical courage. He had shown courage himself in World War II. He was of the generation that fought the war. Eisenhower, of course, was of the generation that ran the war. So he's the guy who is in the front line. So he sees this physical courage, and he becomes an admirer of the protesters. And by the end of his presidency, he sees the civil rights movement as a moral issue, as a moral cause, and he has more African Americans over the White House in a single time during the March on Washington than had ever been there completely total in the previous history of the country. So and part of that was because he was watching the coverage and the imagery of the civil rights movement, and he was very impressed with it. Now, this is another interesting moment here, and then we'll move on to another president. This is a photograph that many of you might remember, another very iconic photograph of the President Kennedy taken by a New York Times photographer named George Thames, who I knew before he passed away. George was a terrific photographer. He had the trust of the Kennedys and of the president, and he was doing a day in the life of the president. You see, we in journalism, we're not that hard to figure out. We always like to do the day in the life of X, Y, and Z. So he's doing this, and he gets tremendous access. He's in and out of the office, the Oval Office, all day. George Thames is, a New York Times guy, very unheard of today. You wouldn't get that kind of access today. You haven't had it for years. But he notices Kennedy in this position at the window. He takes the picture, and then he doesn't really get an explanation of it, and then he shows it to Kennedy in the spread on the Sunday Times magazine, and it's on page 6 or 7, and Kennedy taps it and he says, "That should have been your cover." And he was right. This picture is taking on a life of its own. It's entitled "The Loneliest Job," that the weight of the world is on the president's shoulders, how difficult it is for the president to do the job. But that's not what it is at all. All that's happening here is because of his back pain, he's just reading the newspaper standing up. That's all it is. But again, it took on a life of its own, and Kennedy loved that image, so he let it stand. And George Thames loved it too. So that's sort of the backstory of that photograph. This is, again, a sad moment. Another picture we remember from the Kennedy era after he's assassinated in Dallas in November of 1963. The funeral is about to start in Washington. Jackie Kennedy had said to John Jr. in advance, I'd like you to, you can have a moment and just acknowledge your father at the funeral. And so at this moment, she says to John Jr., "It's time for you to say goodbye to Daddy." So he steps forward and he salutes. The only 2 photographers got the pictures. The White House photographer missed it. It was 2 news photographers, Associated Press and UPI, got this picture. The other photographers were taking pictures of the widow, of the family in the background, but they missed what ended up being the most moving shot was little John Jr. saluting his father. Now, this is Lyndon Johnson. He's sworn in on Air Force One on that horrible day in 1963. This is another, probably the most famous White House photograph, I think. This is Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One. He insisted on being sworn in on the plane because he wanted this picture distributed all over the world. He understands that this is going to be a very, very important moment for him, and he wants to show the Constitution endures, the Kennedy legacy will be continued, and he's in charge. So he has Cecil Stoughton, who was Kennedy's photographer, rush in and get this photograph. Jackie Kennedy, he's being sworn in by the way, a judge he knows in Dallas in a little polka dot dress, but he just rushes her in at the last moment. Jackie is there in the same outfit she had on that morning when her husband was shot with his blood on it. And the Kennedy entourage felt that Johnson was putting her through too much. You look at her face, she's the grieving widow and all, but she understood what Johnson was doing. She understood the need to have this sense of continuity there and solidarity, and so she didn't mind this picture being taken. It was Kennedy's staff that didn't like it, so he didn't get off to a very good start with the staff, but Jackie understood what was going on, and this photograph did work because the country was somewhat reassured that the Constitution was working and that the government was in control as it should be. Johnson had all kinds of bizarre ideas about publicity. I remember reading about how when Johnson started out, Cecil Stoughton, Kennedy's photographer, would bring him stacks of pictures every evening that he'd taken during the day and of Johnson. And he'd sit at his big desk in the Oval Office and he'd look at them and he'd throw them on the floor if he didn't like them. And most of the time he didn't like any of them. So he said to Cecil, the staff photographer, "How come you don't make me look as good as President Kennedy?" Well, that was not going to happen. So he devised his own public relations plans. He said, "I want people to see I'm a down-to-earth guy. I'm not one of these sophisticated Northeasterners or like Jack was." So he would lift his beagles up, his pet beagles, by their ears. And you can see he did it more than once. And after he did it a couple of times, it was distributed around the country and the world, and people were writing letters, "You're abusing your pets." And he stopped doing it, at least publicly. There was a case where the rumors, he was sick and he was out of commission for a while, and rumors were spreading he had cancer. So he said, "Well, I didn't have cancer, I had gallbladder surgery." So he says, "The only way I can get rid of this cancer rumor is to show people what I really had." And he shows people the scar. Now, can we imagine any president doing that except him? No, but it did end the rumors about the cancer, but it just was kind of grossed people out, I think. So I won't leave that up there too long. He loved this kind of an image, him at his ranch in the Pedernales River in central Texas. He was a good rider, he was a cowboy, he loved the ranch, and he liked this kind of a picture that they would have taken. But you also got, he did, after a while, trust the new photographer he brought in, who was a Japanese-American named Yoichi Okamoto, who he had known when he was vice president. And Yoichi had to stand up to Johnson because Johnson liked to really lord his position over everybody, but then he respected you if you stood up to him, and Yoichi did. So he ended up getting tremendous access, and he's now thought of as one of the best White House staff photographers ever because he devised this idea of telling stories with the pictures. Don't let a picture just be an isolated moment. Tell a larger story with it. So here he's Johnson, the cowboy. This is the kind of access that Johnson gave to Okamoto and his staff. Of course, the Vietnam War is escalating. Johnson has ordered more troops in, ordered bombing campaigns. He's very unpopular around the country. Among the troops he sends over to Vietnam was his son-in-law, Chuck Robb, a Marine combat officer who later, of course, became a senator and a governor and senator of Virginia. Chuck Robb sends to Johnson a reel-to-reel tape, which is the tape that they used at the time, of Chuck Robb explaining what's really going on the ground in Vietnam. It wasn't what Johnson was saying publicly. At the minimum, it was a stalemate. At the worst, we were losing. And you can see Johnson's reaction. And he allowed his photographer to see this. Now, they didn't put this out at the time, but you can see this in the White House archives. This is the the visual history that I was talking about before, the anguish that he was going through, because he just felt we can't win the war. I can't tell that to people. So his only answer was escalation. And of course that led to him not running again in 1968 and led to Richard Nixon's victory. Richard Nixon had a very difficult relationship with his photographer, a guy named Ollie Atkins. He liked to be conveying himself as the tough guy, the man who is not who was sort of invulnerable to criticism. He was going to take on the world. And now, who does this remind us of? This image. I'll show you some more of that in a minute. But anyway, he just always wanted to be shown as the tough, strong leader, and this is the kind of image he liked to convey. He did have orders for his photographer, Ollie Atkins, 6 and out. That meant he listened to Ollie, snapped 6 pictures, and then he'd throw them out. That's all he was allowed to take. Now, Kennedy would never have done stuff like that, or Johnson for that matter, but Nixon just didn't think the photography was worth his while to have these more endearing images, so he didn't let them be shown. One time, however, this, by the way, is the most sought picture in the National Archives of any president, even today. Somebody calls the White House and says, I'd like to talk to the president. This is Elvis Presley. Oh, sure, the operator says. Yeah, you're really Elvis. So anyway, one thing leads to another, and Elvis gets his meeting with the president. He shows up. Elvis wants a law enforcement badge. He says he wants to catch drug traffickers. Now, the irony is he was abusing prescription drugs himself at this time. He shows up at the White House. Nixon feels, well, maybe the young people will like it if I reach out to Elvis and they see this. So he wanted this picture taken. He couldn't come up with chit-chat. Before this, he tells his staff, I don't know this guy Elvis. I mean, I don't know his music. I don't know what I'm going to talk to him about. He says, the only people I really understand in music are the great jazz musicians like Guy Lombardo. Really what he said. So anyway, the best chit-chat he came up with was, that's quite an outfit you have on there, Mr. Presley. And Elvis says, I have my audience and you have yours. So it was probably a good comeback. But it's still a very popular picture. When you first see it, you're sort of taken aback because they don't seem to belong together. But he did try. Now, at the very end of his presidency, Nixon did relent, and he allowed the personal pictures to be taken. I always just wonder why presidents don't do this routinely, but they don't. Kennedy did what most of the presidents have not done, this kind of thing. The night before he leaves office, he announces to the country, because of the Watergate scandal in 1974, in August, he's going to leave the next day at noon. So that night, the night before he leaves, he has his photographer, Ollie Atkins, to the White House, invites him over. He says, I'd like to get some pictures of the family on my last night at the White House. It's a terribly, terribly sad time for everybody. Ollie, the photographer, doesn't know what to say. The Nixons don't know what to say with him there, so he just wants to get out of there as soon as he can. But he manages to get these very poignant photographs, the pictures that Nixon never wanted people to see, of him vulnerable, of him privately hugging his daughter Julie, his other daughter Tricia there, ready to burst into tears, which she did after this picture was taken, and Tricia's husband, but he never really liked this kind of image to be out there, but he did relent at the very end of his presidency. Who knows why? Maybe just wanted people to see that he was sort of more human than they thought he was. And so that's how that ended. Gerald Ford comes into office. He had been Nixon's vice president, had been a congressman from Michigan. Ford had a tremendously close relationship to his photographer, David Kennerly. One of the closest relationships presidents have ever had with their photographer. He trusted Kennerly. He liked the pictures to be taken. He liked pictures to be shown to the country. Kennerly was very open with letting news photographers get a lot of access to Ford because they love this too. So Ford has tremendous access that he grants. Although it does have a negative side to it. I was at Denver at the time covering politics and government out there. So when he went to go skiing in Vail, Colorado, I would cover those events. And he would take a fall. Now, anybody who skis, you're always going to take some kind of a spill, but you never see that with presidents. Ford just let the photographers take the pictures. And I remember later on, I won the award his foundation has given out. I won it a couple of times. When he was alive, he would give it to the reporter who won it. And the first time I won, he said, you're one of those people. You did all those stories about me skiing in Vail when I was falling on my keister, he said. So I said, yeah, I did the stories. And he was very magnanimous. He said, well, it was my own fault. I'm the one who took the fall, so no hard feelings. So he was a very decent man in many ways. This is another Ford picture where he, if I can get this to move. I think we're stalled here.
Can we go backwards, maybe?
No, not going backwards either.
Yeah. Ken, I will do it manually. So
Okay.
when you say go, I'll go.
Okay. We'll try. Maybe it's just stalled here, but it worked
maybe
before.
we can get it to go.
Okay, you want to just move to the next one then? Okay. This is where he fell down the stairs of Air Force One. He was in Salzburg, Austria. It was raining very heavily. He's at the top of the stairs. Betty, you can see his wife, has an umbrella. The steward on the plane says, "Mr. President, it's very slippery out there. Why don't I help Betty down the stairs and you can hold on to the railing?" Jerry Ford says, "No, I'll help Betty down." So very gentlemanly, he puts one arm around her waist, helps her hold the umbrella. He falls. He takes a spill. He lands at the bottom in a three-point landing in front of the cameras. The world is watching. He recovers nicely. He stands up to the guy who's meeting him there, and he says, "So glad to drop in," he says. So it's, again, that magnanimous Ford. But this is the kind of image that really haunted him, because remember the Saturday Night Live? Chevy Chase is playing him as a nincompoop. He's falling. He's bunking into things, tripping. This picture really did hurt Ford because it sort of fed into that image of him that he can never really break out of. Now, okay, let's go to the next one. This is another example of how he would have meetings, and he let pictures be taken of him in his jammies and his robe and his slippers. And he's meeting with his senior staff on some foreign policy. There's Rumsfeld there and all these senior people, but he didn't mind. He felt this is the way he did things. Let's go to the next one. And this is Betty. Betty had been a dancer. And you can see how they have a wonderful couple. And as time went on, and after he lost the election, she said, "You know, I always wanted to dance on the table in the cabinet room. So I'm going to do it." And she had Kennerly come and take her picture. And she did it, barefoot, dancing on the table, the free spirit, perfect embodiment of Betty Ford. So I'd always like to show that picture too. Let's go to the next one. President Carter does not hire a chief photographer. He feels like it's not his, it's beneath his dignity, and he's not worth his time to have a photographer around having private pictures taken. Now, he does have some important things that happen that he allows. He keeps military photographers around, but he doesn't have that relationship with any single photographer that the chief photographers do. So he lets the military photographers take his pictures. This is the famous Camp David Accords, where he meets with the leaders of Israel and Egypt, Begin and Sadat. A very historic moment. The Accords held up beautifully over many, many years, and so he does allow this photograph to be taken. But since he's not allowing a lot of other pictures to be taken of him by the staff photographers or by the news photographers, of course the news photographers are looking, frankly, for ways to punish him. So this is the kind of thing he gets. You know, I mean, there's ways that a photographer can make something like this look less bad than it is in this picture. It looks like the president is collapsing. He's exhausted. He's doing a jog. He was actually a pretty healthy guy, a pretty fit guy. But they get the worst possible moment. And this was distributed all over the world. You know, that Carter, he was a very tough guy for a lot of people to deal with. He didn't play by the rules that people thought should exist, including the access rules. So this is one thing that happened. Now, it turned out he was exhausted. But this became a paradigm of his whole presidency, the collapsing Carter presidency. And it was not good for his whole image. Now, we can't take too much time on all of them. This is one of Ronald Reagan's favorite pictures ever. This is a picture taken of him at his ranch in California. What he's doing here, he always loved this picture. It was taken by his photographer, Mike Evans. He got along very well with Mike Evans, trusted him very well. That combination I mentioned, trust and being a good photographer, worked in this case. And what this illustrates, I think, the idea that Evans talks about in interviews he has given about President Reagan, and you see from the visual history, he's putting a smiling face on conservatism. That's a part of his magic. He can convey the optimism that Franklin Roosevelt used to convey, but do it for conservative ideas. Now, Reagan had been a Democrat. He had admired Roosevelt. He had studied Roosevelt, and he liked the idea of optimism. So he always tried to show that Roosevelt kind of optimism during his whole presidency, which he did succeed in doing. This is another famous picture of Reagan. This is when he was actually hit by the bullet fired by John Hinckley Jr. when he was getting into the car outside the Washington Hilton and he was giving a speech. What happened was he was waving to the crowd. Hinckley fires shots, hits a bunch of people, Secret Service people and so on, and one of the bullets bounces off the side of the armor-plated limousine and goes into Reagan's chest. The Secret Service guys, of course, are looking over at the shooter. They push Reagan into the car. This picture won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way, for a new White House reporter, photographer on the beat, not the staff photographer. The staff photographer was out of position. An AP photographer named Ron Edmonds got this picture and won a Pulitzer for it. He was new on the beat, by the way, so all the other news photographers resented the idea, but he got the shot. And Reagan is pushed in the vehicle, and at this point, they don't know he's shot. Reagan feels a tremendous pain in his chest, and he thinks that the Secret Service guys have broken his ribs by pushing him into the car. So he says, "What are you guys doing? I'm okay." Then they notice he's coughing up blood. So instead of taking him to the White House, they take him to the George Washington University Medical Center, and that saves his life. If they had taken him to the White House, he almost certainly would have died. And it wasn't clear how much peril he was in at the time, but we now know that he was really at the end of his life if he had not been taken to that emergency room immediately. And this picture, I think, sort of captures the suddenness of that amazing moment for the country. What's happening now with Reagan, he's using, again, as Kennedy had done, photography to show important historic moments in his presidency, including meetings with foreign leaders. This is him at Reykjavik at the summit meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. Now, look, they look downcast. Both of them look unhappy with things. It's not a tense situation, but you can see something has gone wrong. What has gone wrong is that both these leaders had gotten to the point of starting to negotiate the end of all nuclear weapons, an incredible leap of the superpowers. But the whole thing falls apart, and the aides, the advisors of both of them are shocked that they're going this far, the two leaders trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. But what happens is Reagan had something called, we nicknamed Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, to have missiles being shot down by a special technology that the United States was developing. Gorbachev did not want to go along with this. He said, "You have to give up Star Wars," and the whole thing collapses. So as they go to the car, Pete Souza is there, who's at the time a deputy photographer for Reagan. He later comes on to Obama's staff as a chief photographer, for only person who's ever done that, for two presidents. And he hears the last remarks that they make to each other. Gorbachev says to Reagan as he's about to leave, "I don't know what else I could have done." And Reagan says, "You could have said yes." That's the lead of the story the next day. And so that's a very important moment for Reagan historically. Now, this is the Brandenburg Gate moment where he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Just a personal moment. I was actually there at the bottom of that podium when he said that. And I think those of us in that press group thought the old guy has lost it. We're never going to see this wall torn down in our lifetime. Of course, he was right and we were wrong. So he understood the capturing of this moment, very important for him. Lots of times at the White House, we think we know what's going on, we really don't. Reagan reached out to many more people than we ever knew at the time. He went to a school in Washington. He asked the school principal to give him the name of a person he could be a pen pal with, a precocious young student. The name was given of this fellow named Rudy Hines, who you see in the picture there. Rudy Hines kept up a letter correspondence with Reagan for the rest of Reagan's life, even after he left the White House. They communicated. Reagan had Rudy and his mother, a single mom, to the White House for meals. They went to their apartment secretly. This is a picture of them at Rudy's apartment, Nancy and Ron, to have meals with them. And so he was reaching out to people. A lot of people felt he would not do this sort of thing, but he was. He was doing it privately, but he didn't want to intrude on the privacy of this family. So lots of times it's sort of a lesson in humility for us in the press corps. We don't really know what's going on most of the time over there, and this is one case where this story completely eluded us. And of course, Reagan was a master of self-deprecation. If you listen to some of his speeches and his jokes, again, I wonder why politicians don't understand that Americans love when a president makes fun of himself. It takes a lot of edge off things, and it makes the president much more appealing, and Reagan understood how to do this. President Bush, the father, was not as good as Reagan in imagery, of course. You don't remember a lot of the vivid moments of President Bush. He had a very good photographer named David Valdez, but he didn't allow a lot of the stuff to get out there, except he did allow photographs of his family. He loved the photographs of his kids and his grandchildren. And there was a case where at Kennebunkport, his home in Maine, it was a case where he was being the subject of another one of these day in the life of the presidents. We've talked about this before. This was the vacation of the president. Actually, he was vice president at the time, but the same pattern held up. So he didn't want an outside photographer there at his home estate, so he had Dave Valdez, his trusted photographer, do the pictures for the news coverage. And so Dave goes to Barbara Bush and says, "What's going on?" She says, "Okay, we trust you. You can have as much access as you want. Come tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning and see what happens." He shows up, and this is the most memorable picture of Bush. The children come pouring into the room, the grandchildren, his children, they jump into bed with him. I always get a kick out of this picture because you can see how President Bush was not a very good subject for photography. Barbara is very aware of the camera. President Bush looks like he literally just woke up, hasn't brushed his hair, doesn't know where to look. But that's the way he was. He didn't like the idea of stagecraft, so we don't have a lot of this kind of memorable photography. This is probably the most memorable picture he had taken during his time as vice president and president. Now, President Clinton comes into office. This is him on election night. He's trying to go back to the Kennedy image, the young, vibrant, exciting young guy. He has a photographer named Bob McNeely, later Sharon Farmer, the first woman chief photographer. He gives them a lot of access. They don't put a lot of the pictures out, but you can see a lot of things that he didn't like the country to know about him, the flash and fade temper, where he'd get out, and this is George Stephanopoulos, who's now an ABC commentator. He was the communications director at the time. Clinton is giving him a reaming out because the press are asking questions he doesn't like. But he let the picture be taken, and McNeely, his photographer, kept it in the archives. Didn't reveal this kind of picture at the time, but we have the record of it, of Clinton, the angry private president. This is the big thing we remember from Clinton, the Monica Lewinsky year, really a wasted year for his presidency and the country, really. He was impeached. I show you this because this just took over the news media, and it took over the whole country, took over the Congress, the White House. Everybody was looking for a picture of Monica Lewinsky in the early phases of this, and nobody could find one. The White House wasn't putting them out, which we understand. Dirk Halstead, a friend of mine, a photographer at the time, said to himself, "I've seen her somewhere from what I hear of her." So he hired a photo researcher. They went through thousands and thousands of pictures, and they find Monica and Bill. What she was doing is she was going to rope lines to catch his attention. She wore this beret, and of course she did catch his attention, as we now know. And then later on they put out other pictures of them together, but this shows that perseverance can work in some cases. But in this case, the imagery is not good for the president, and this is him. "I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," that famous moment. Of course he did. He later admitted it. He had committed perjury under oath. This is what he was impeached for, basically, and you could see the strain as his presidency went on. Just as a final note about this, he does admit he had lied. He is impeached by the House, and then he's acquitted by the Senate. Now we're going to an impeachment proceeding now with President Trump. But by the end of his presidency, Clinton had rebounded in popularity again, because he had made the country understand that they should, in his mind, evaluate him separately, his private character from his public policies, which the country did. So at the end of his presidency, he was popular again, because he had asked for acceptance and forgiveness, and then he moved on to end up being quite a popular president in public terms. Now, this is the single vivid moment of President Bush the son, the famous bullhorn moment in New York. This happened 3 days after 9/11, the terrible terrorist attacks. He goes to New York. The first responders are there. The smoldering ruins of the World Trade Towers are behind him. I was actually there for this very moment, just off camera here. Those of us who were there knew this was going to be a defining moment for his presidency. Not a great picture, but it captured exactly what he was trying to do, showed the strength the country wanted from the president at that moment. He gets up on a burned out fire truck. He starts to talk to the first responders. They say, "We can't hear you." He pulls up. One of the first responders turned out to be a retired fireman who turned up to help people that day, grabs a bullhorn, and he says, "I can hear you, and the world will hear from all of us very soon." And that's exactly what the country wanted to hear from President Bush. So just in a nutshell, this one moment is what a lot of people remember from him. Not a lot of vivid pictures of Bush over time, but this one is one of the most memorable that's ever been taken of a president. Now we're President Obama. I show you this just in contrast to that President Polk picture. Remember the picture of him with the... Now look how things have changed. People are taking fabulous pictures with their mobile cameras, with their mobile phones. It's the democratization of photography is what it amounts to. Technology has reached the point where presidents can use photography for themselves by letting the public have access to them. And this is what President Obama did. He was very good at sharing private moments at the White House. It started really under Kennedy. You saw this in other cases. This is the famous picture he allowed his chief photographer, Pete Souza, to take of him in the Situation Room, the Holy of Holies at the White House, the most secret place in the White House. This is the raid that killed bin Laden. The actual raid in real time was being shown on the screen. One of the soldiers was showing it, was taking the pictures, conveying it back there. See President Obama's there, Joe Biden is there. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, sees something that's troubling her. At least she seems to be something's troubling her. She has quarreled with that notion. She said she wasn't really, but it looks that way. But it's a very dramatic moment, and it's, again, the photography that has now gotten to the utterly secret places of the White House to convey the image that the president wants, which is here, him in control and being decisive. He shows the private side again. Now, this is another interesting moment. President spent a lot of time, by the way, in freight elevators because it's more secure than other ways of getting around hotels and such. He's lent Michelle, his wife, his tuxedo jacket. It looks like it's a private, maybe even an intimate moment, but presidents complain about lack of privacy. Well, look at this. The Secret Service guys, they don't know where to look. They don't want to look at the couple. They're looking over to the side, looking at the papers, looking at their feet. This is what happens sometimes with the presidents. But Obama allowed these pictures. He loved these kind of pictures. As I say, 2 million pictures a year of Obama, and they were brilliantly conceived and really conveyed this likable, engaged guy, which I think he actually really was. This is probably one of my favorite pictures of any president. This is a picture. President Obama was very serious about being a role model for African-American boys. He was very serious about this. One of his staff members, an African-American guy you can see in the picture, was leaving White House service, brings his family in. His son looks at the president. He's dressed up. He starts to mumble something. He's getting very nervous. So the father says, "Go ahead. You can ask him." So President Obama says, What do you want to ask me?" So the little boy says, "My hair looks just like yours. I just wondered if your hair felt like mine." So President Obama bends over. The little boy puts his hand on Obama's head. Very unusual that a president would do something like this. And then President Obama says, "What do you think?" And the boy says, "Yeah, it feels just like mine." And it's just really a wonderful moment. But Obama, I think it was very genuine. He was very interested in this role model part of the presidency. Now we're at the President Trump. Larger than life. He loves this image of himself. And I know when I give this talk and I give other talks, people say, "Why is he always scowling? Why are you always showing him angry?" Well, this is the image he wants. I and other people would use other images of President Trump, but people don't see them because he doesn't want them out there. Again, the angry, taking on the establishment, taking on whatever he's taking on, shaking up the status quo. Again, that Nixon, everything has to be tough and not show vulnerability. him with foreign leaders, the stubborn president. He liked this picture a lot. A lot of people see this picture, thinks he wouldn't like it. He does. He liked this. He's standing up to the world here. They're trying to convince him of something at a G7 meeting, and he won't go along with it. But he likes that. And again, another example. Now, this is at the funeral service of President Bush, the father. Everybody else is participating in the service, but not President Trump. But again, this is the image he likes, the sort of the outlier, the guy who's sort of outside of the normal norms of the presidency. Now, you don't see pictures like this very often. I mentioned this earlier. Kennedy did these pictures with the family. You rarely see President Trump with his grandchildren. I don't know why. I mean, he apparently has a fine relationship with his grandchildren. Maybe he doesn't trust photographers, even his own photographer, to take pictures of them that will look good, or maybe he just feels it's intrusive. But whatever, I think he's missing a tremendous opportunity here, because you never see pictures of him, or very, very rarely of him with the family, sort of the devoted family man. Very, very rare. This is again the kind of thing that happens. He gets on the plane, and he didn't like this picture. He's got some cash sticking out of his back pocket. See, photographers will find these things. This is what you learn as a White House correspondent. They always have the president in their viewfinders, so they'll see things that you don't notice. I don't know what that's all about, but he later said he just wanted to have money for tips. Okay, whatever. He's got like $200 there. It was examined very closely, but he didn't like this. And then this is the image, the kind of image he likes. He praised this picture. This is him when the president travels different places, and Air Force One, the big jumbo jet, can't get there. The president uses a smaller plane, but he loved this lightning strike that was captured in the photography, and he thought this was like the best image he'd seen of the presidency, the excitement and the drama of the presidency. Just as a contrast, the following picture I'm about to show you is President Obama's favorite picture of him on Air Force One. Now, what a difference in self-perception here, isn't it? But anyway, that was a famous Pete Souza picture. Just to wind up here, President Trump's first official portrait. Again, the scowling, sort of angry, sort of suspicious guy. But something is going on, and maybe it's because the campaign is coming out, so you might see another side of Trump, because they put out another picture of him not too long ago. Much different, isn't it? So maybe we're going to see some other side of President Trump. We haven't been seeing it this week, by the way, I must say, including today, when there was a very difficult incident at the White House involving the congressional leadership. But something was going on here, so we'll see how it goes. But anyway, I'll just take, I think we have some time for some questions. I just wanted to, so in summary, the White House photographers have become really instrumental in creating the imagery of the modern presidency, both in letting us understand the modern presidents, both in their visual histories and in their observations that they talk about in diaries, interviews with people like me, and other things. So they become really indispensable to the modern presidency as the ultimate insider. So with that, thank you very much for coming. Do you want to do some questions? I think.
Can you turn off the...
Yeah. Okay, well.
Go back to Roosevelt.
Go back to Roosevelt? Well, I guess we might have to shut it off. There you go. Okay, so anybody, photographers covering the White House, whatever you want to talk about, I'm happy to do it. So, anything from anyone?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you, when you still take a photographer, you use all digital equipment nowadays?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a photographer. I'm a White House correspondent, but the photographers, yeah, they use the digital cameras. I mean, in my book, I go into all this at some length. And the technology is so much more important. What the photographers love are these Leica, quiet Leica cameras, the staff photographers, because they want to be unobtrusive. So what you find, just as a shorthand here for what's happened, is in the old days, you remember those speed graphics, those big boxy cameras? You see pictures of photographers taking pictures with the hats and the press cards in their hats, the stereotype. Those are the big cameras. They love those. The photographers love them because they took very sharp pictures, but they were very slow because you had to change each frame in that big camera. Now you hit that frame and they'll get 100 pictures in a couple of seconds. That's why there's so many pictures at the White House now. But what the photographers tell me is that they like the most is the quieter the camera, the better, because they don't want to be noticed. The big thing for these staff photographers is they want to be like furniture. They don't want people to realize they're there, and the best of them manage to do this, especially after they work with the president for a long time. They can be very quiet, and you can see them hunching down and sort of slow walking things and that sort of stuff. But the real premium they have is so the people don't hear the shutter going off. It's just as simple as that. But the cameras do work very well, and that technology. And as you see, what I showed you the picture of the cell phone cameras. Presidents love to have their selfies taken. The people take selfies of them. It just goes on all the time, and people get very good pictures that way. So it's the technology that has increased the importance really of photography at the White House. And the White House website is very important. The photographers, not so much today, but with Obama in particular, and to some extent with President Bush the son, but more with Obama, for those 8 years, there were hundreds of thousands of really good pictures put up on the White House website that the public could tap into, and on things like Flickr, Instagram, other places. President Trump uses Twitter, of course, but that's for his daily angry comments, not so much pictures. But the White House can put the pictures out directly to its own constituencies through the White House website, which they do a lot. So, anyone else? Yes. Well, why don't we start here? We'll go in the back. Yeah.
Have any of the presidents been photographers themselves and left a record of their view of the presidency as photographers?
Yeah, have any of the presidents, just to repeat the question, have any of the presidents been photographers themselves and left photographs of their view? No. Occasionally, like a president will like grab a camera and just take a few pictures. Harry Truman would do that. Bill Clinton would do that. Bush the father would do that. But it's just more like a jokey thing. But no, the closest we've come is when Howard Baker, the former senator from Tennessee, was chief of staff. He was a photographer, and he took a lot of pictures. When he was in a lot of the meetings, of course. So he said, because of my position as chief of staff, I have some of the best pictures of Ronald Reagan in the back of his head, which is true because he didn't want to get in front of him. He wanted to be in the back. But that's one thing. Another thing, though, is Susan Ford, President Ford's daughter, was a photographer, and she actually took lessons from David Kennerly, the chief White House photographer. I think she actually dated him too, but it was so there was a member of the family who was a photographer, and that helped Kennerly, the chief photographer, get a lot of access because the president's daughter was on his side in a lot of things in the access department. So, but not the presidents themselves. Yes.
So you mentioned that there were 2 million or so photos of the Obamas. Did they preserve all of those photos? Or
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, what happens is, no, that was 2 million a year.
Oh, wow.
And that's by all the White House staff photographers. So you can imagine the volume of that. That's when you look, and you could see every one of them if you wanted to, but it'd take you forever. So you have to really know what you're looking for. Somebody like me who writes books about this sort of stuff, and so I want to see the pictures, I might know the time frame, I can narrow it down, or who was there, and that sort of thing. But if you don't know that, it's just endless. And but they belong to the country, those pictures. The photographers should not be taking them home for their private stockpiles of pictures. Now, the news photographers can do that, but the White House photographers should not do that. So all those pictures should be public domain now. And that's good for somebody like me who wants to put them in the book, because I have to pay $12 each just to have them reproduced. Sometimes these private pictures are $10,000, $20,000. So anyway, if you want them, you can get them. And it's... a lot of people do that. So, anyone else? Yes, in the back.
You had mentioned with some of the presidents, like I think with Lyndon Johnson, where they didn't want a certain picture released or used just because of the image it would show. So at what point was that released, especially since the images are public usage? Was that like after they passed away?
Right.
Was it after they left the presidency?
Well, some presidents have different ways of doing this. Some presidents want to see, especially if something is considered sensitive or really historic, they want to approve that picture themselves. And after a while, the photographer will know that and will go right to a president. But most of the time, there's a structure for it. The press secretary at the White House often decides what pictures to use every day, more than once a day. The chief of staff sometimes gets involved. The communications director, sometimes all of them. Sometimes the national security advisor gets involved. So it just depends on how the president wants to handle it. But certainly in like that Situation Room picture, I'm sure they had to go to Obama. They said, we want to release, and he let it go. But Sousa had this historic picture, and I'm sure they went to him because everything that goes on in that room is supposed to be ultra secret. So I think they would have had to go to the president, and he approved it. But it really depends. Today, I think if it's a very sensitive thing, I have no doubt that Trump puts a real clamp on things. He just will not allow things out unless, and he has very, very strict rules. Other presidents have had them too. He doesn't like pictures taken from the front because it shows his double chin. He doesn't like pictures taken from the side when he's shouting because it looks like he's fat. And he's got all these rules. So the photographers are always complaining, the news photographers, that they're under all these limits. You can't do this or that. The president doesn't like it, and he'll complain. He'll say, you know, you made me look bad again today, or something like that. But he has a good relationship with some of the news photographers. But most of the time, it's just he's just so controlling that he just puts them in sort of boxes, almost literally, so they can't get the pictures that they want, and that causes a lot of hard feelings. Yeah.
But later, years from now, we'll be able to access them.
Yeah, years from now, yeah. I mean, unless something changes and he changes the rules or just takes boxes of pictures home with him or takes digital files with him or something, I wouldn't doubt that could happen. But no, the question is, years from now, could we get access to these? Under the current rules, yes. Because all the pictures taken by the White House photographers, the staff photographers, are public property. They're doing it on our money as taxpayers. So we should have access to those pictures. And that's the rule as of this moment. Yes?
I had a question about the role of the First Lady and
Yes.
whether there is any First Lady that has controlled access to the White House photographer or used that access to promote her own ideas.
Yeah, I mean, has the First Lady's controlled access of the White House photography? Yes. And that's why I was saying earlier that to do the job right, the photographers have to get the trust of the First Lady, because she can close off a lot of things, particularly what goes on in the residence of the White House, like those pictures of Ford and his jammies, or things like the freight elevator with the Obamas. The First Lady could very easily say, I don't want any of that done. And the presidents, they do not go against the First Lady very often in cases like that. In other cases, I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess that the photographers are under tremendous limitations on Melania today. When do you ever see pictures of Melania privately? Almost never. You never see her with Barron. You never see her with any of the family. Now, that's very unusual, because First Ladies generally like that. That's one thing that Barbara Bush loved about the photographers, is they'd get these wonderful pictures of the grandchildren and all this sort of thing. Now, you don't see that, and I can't say that I've gotten to the root of that. I don't really know exactly what's happening there, but just based on the public evidence, when do you ever see pictures of Melania? It's just at public events, public occasions. Maybe she doesn't trust the photographers, even her own photographer.
But she's not living in the White House on a day-to-day basis, right?
Well, she's there. She's there.
Living somewhere with her son, right?
Well, that's a story that has not really been told. But Barron apparently is not living there, and but sometimes he's there. Now they don't talk about this, and they control the information. We don't know in the press corps how that works. If we did, I'm sure you see stories about it all the time. But you know, I mean, she'll go down to Mar-a-Lago for trips on her own a lot. She'll go she'll go to different places. Now, Jackie Kennedy did that sort of thing too, but in this case, it's her relationship with her husband is such a sensitive thing that, I mean, I can't say that any of us in the press corps really know what's going on there. We just don't. And the White House, I mean, in the campaign year, you're probably going to have people talking out of school about this stuff, given what's been going on. But as of now, we don't know. I mean, are they living separate lives? Well, you know, there's some indication that she isn't wild about being at some of these events with her husband. You know, we've seen those images. But I don't want to take that too far because I really don't know. But that's a story we might hear a lot more about next year. So
I think we better.
yeah. Okay. Thank you.